Usually stories start with once upon a time, but this story is completely different because it's actually just repeating itself.
In the past 2 decades, China has built large infrastructure projects in almost every country in Africa.
There's a new highway in Pakistan, and a new rail terminal in Kazakhstan. A seaport in Sri Lanka recently opened, as well as this bridge in rural Laos. What's interesting is that they're all part of one country's project that spans 3 continents and touches over 60% of the world's population. If you connect the dots, it's not hard to see which country that is. This is China.
The impressive new headquarters of the African Union, entirely funded by the Chinese government.
This bridge behind me is the largest suspension bridge in the country.
Construction work on the longest suspension bridge in Maputo, Mozambique has started, led by the China, budgeted to cost $725 million.
In fact, this is the largest suspension bridge in the continent, and it was built and offered by the government of China. And this is just one of the huge buildings offered by China to this country. Look at this gigantic building offered to one of the best universities from Africa and the best in Mozambique. This is the School of Communication and Arts. It is, by the way, where I used to study before I finished my degree, but that's another story. Right by its side, there is another building which was also offered and built by the government of China. But unfortunately, I couldn't get a permission to enter the building. But the question here is why? Why is China doing all this? And how will these super poor countries pay for all these super expensive constructions? But hold on, we're not speaking about just this country here, because as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, this story is just repeating itself, and it's repeating in all African countries.
We've already seen Chinese investments in Chinese infrastructure.
A common
projects have
portrayal
been
of
linked
China's
to
lending
increasing
practices is known as debt trap diplomacy.
Well, not so long ago, the creator of ties with different countries, provider of high monuments, infrastructure, support, etc. was the United States. However, for some time now, not so much has been seen, or maybe I'm just distracted, but not distracted by trivial things, but with a similar behavior that has been shown by China in more recent years, precisely in the last 2 decades. I live in one of the African countries blessed by the spirit of kindness from China, and little is heard from countries like the United States when the subject is the offer of great monuments, magnificent buildings, gigantic infrastructures with prices hovering the billions of dollars, and all this comes as an offer to strengthen bilateral cooperations. Well, I may not be an expert in geopolitics, but I'm sure of one thing. In geopolitics, there is no such thing as an offer with no returns. Or in other words, no country is foolish enough to spend lots of money only as a method of strengthening friendship. There is always a purpose. So the question is, what is China's purpose while investing in Africa? So in this documentary, we will explore China's growing presence in Africa and the complex dynamics it plays. But before we even go there, let's bring in some context. In the late 1970s, China was a poor and isolated country, largely dependent on agriculture for its livelihood. Now, I won't go into historical details with dates and main participants about the reasons that led to this great revolution, call it Chinese Revolution, but over the past 4 decades, China has undergone a transformation that is nothing short of extraordinary. In less than 50 years, China has been able to build one of the greatest world powers that currently exists, and it is just not bigger than the United States because the United States hasn't decided yet. But all this growth, all this territorial expansion, all this economic and social development has brought some great demands. Since China's economic boom has been fueled by rapid industrialization, urbanization and globalization, and as the country has developed its own infrastructure and saturated its domestic market, very quickly they felt the need to start looking for other places for new sources of raw materials and new market for its goods. So let me make it as clear as possible. There are a few reasons why China has started looking for new sources of raw materials and new market for its goods in other countries, which actually is a continent, the African continent. First, China's own domestic market has become saturated. As the country developed its own infrastructure and experienced rapid economic growth, the demand for certain goods and materials rapidly declined. It was as if nobody was looking for anything anymore, and this led Chinese companies to look for new markets abroad, and you already know where they did it. And second, China's economic growth has also put pressure on the country's domestic resources. As the country industrialized and urbanized, it consumed huge amounts of natural resources such as oil, gas, and minerals. And to meet this demand, China had to move abroad to look for new sources for these minerals and natural resources. And once again, Africa, with its vast natural resources, has become an attractive destination for Chinese companies looking to secure these resources. So here it is, the two main possible reasons for the great Chinese led gifts to African countries. But the story doesn't stop here. In fact, this is just the beginning.
A long time ago, in what we now call Greece, there lived a people called the Achaeans. And far to the east was a great city with a big door and high walls. The city's name was Troy. The Achaeans came from all over Greece and gathered outside the walls of Troy to lay siege to the city, trying to capture it. And for over 10 years, they tried to break down that big door. Luckily, one of the Achaean leaders, Odysseus, had an idea. They built a giant wooden horse to offer as a gift to the Trojans. Then Odysseus hid inside, along with some soldiers, while the rest of the Achaean army took cover out of sight. The next morning, all that was left was a giant wooden horse at the edge of the camp. The Trojans were overcome with joy at having won the war and decided to bring the gift inside the city. Later that night, after the Trojans had fallen fast asleep, Odysseus slipped out of the Trojan horse with his band of soldiers. They opened Troy's big door and let in the rest of the Achaean army.
Okay, so now you know the story behind the Trojan horse. In simple words, it's about a poisoned gift. A gift that in reality is not a gift, but instead a weapon to dominate or destroy. So now let's take a look at some of the Trojan horses offered by China to some African countries. In 2012, China agreed to fund the construction of a new building for the headquarters of the African Union as a gift to the organization. The project was completed in 2017, and since then, the building has become a symbol of China's growing presence and influence in Africa.
This swanky new building, the tallest in Addis Ababa, cost around $200 million. It was a gift from the Chinese government to the African Union as a sign of their growing partnership.
Okay, now there have been some concerns about the terms of China's funding for the project, with some critics arguing that the terms of the loan may not have been entirely transparent. However, there is no evidence to suggest that the construction had any sinister terms to control over Africa. But here's where things start to get weird. Around 2017 to 2018, major newspapers like Le Monde, The Guardian, and Medium published a series of articles mentioning cases of espionage in African Union's headquarters. According to the information published on these sites, which you can have access through the video description, the Chinese government had access to all information that circulated inside the buildings. And it happened kinda like this.
An IT engineer is looking at the servers in this building, and something seems off. The engineer notices that often in the middle of the night, these servers are connecting to some server in Shanghai and uploading emails and audio files. The African Union headquarters was built in 2012. But it was not paid for by any African nation. The African Union IT team eventually removed these Chinese servers and installed new ones. The Chinese government literally offered to install them for them, but they declined. The local IT people also swept the building, and they found microphones embedded in the furniture and in the walls. The whole building was bugged and had been feeding audio and internal emails to China for like 5 years since the building was built. China building a headquarters for the African Union and then spying on it is a pretty good symbol of what China is up to in Africa.
Well, if these newspapers are right, then it means that China holds in its hands all the political, economic, and social strategic plans that several African countries intend to implement. That alone is enough to understand the dark side of China's offerings. But it doesn't stop here. There are still bridges, dams, railways, roads, ports, and the list goes on and on and on. But all these gifts come with strings attached. Question is, what is inside the horse? Nowadays, a new way of colonization has emerged in Africa, one that no longer uses military force or direct political control, but through economic means. Throughout the entire continent, except for this little country which is formerly known as Swaziland, infrastructure projects funded by China have been popping up, and I mean the infrastructure I mentioned a few minutes ago, from highways to ports to power plants. And now I'll try to explain in simple words the price of these free offers, or what comes inside the horse. As it turns out, the costs are high and the benefits are few. These projects, often referred to as debt trap, come with exorbitant interest rates and strict repayment terms, and the poor African countries desperate for development and lacking other options have been willing to accept these terms. But as the debt piles up, it becomes clear that these countries will never be able to pay it off, and so they're forced to hand over control of their natural resources and infrastructure to China as a collateral. A good example of this case is the giant port built by China in the small island nation of Sri Lanka. A project was carried out that intended to bring economic development and modernization. The Chinese financed and built the port of Hambantota. It was hailed as a great achievement and a symbol of the strong relationship between the two countries. But as the years passed, it became clear that the port was not the blessing it promised to be. In fact, it became a debt trap that enmeshed Sri Lanka in a web of financial obligations to China. The terms of the deal were heavily skewed in China's favor, with exorbitant interest rates and strict repayment plans. And as the debt mounted, Sri Lanka found itself unable to pay it off. So in 2017, faced with the prospect of default, the Sri Lankan government was forced to hand over control of the port to China for a period of 99 years. In fact, the port has become a Chinese colony within Sri Lanka's borders. And so, the people of Sri Lanka have also suffered as a result of this debt trap, since to pay it off, the government has been forced to cut social services and increase taxes, leading to widespread discontent among the population.
Later in 2010, Sri Lanka borrowed $1.2 billion from China to build the Hambantota port. The island country was unable to run the port and repay the debt. The result, China and Sri Lanka negotiated, and Sri Lanka had to hand over the crucial and critical port to China on lease for 99 years. Shashi Dhanatunga, an economist, has said the loans taken from China triggered the misery in Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka handed over its crucial port to China in 2017. Soon after, COVID-19 added more debts to their economy.
Well, the port of Hambantota stands as a cautionary tale, just like the Trojan horse tale, a reminder of the dangers of unchecked globalization and the need for caution when entering into deals with this pretty godfather. Because just the way it happened to Sri Lanka, it can also happen to any other African country. For example, this huge bridge in Mozambique hasn't been paid yet, so what will happen if the country is unable to pay the debt? Well, probably China will take over the land, or maybe take over the bridge, or whatever they want to do. Well, China's actions have sparked outrage and condemnation from the international community. But as the global economic landscape shifts, with China becoming an increasingly dominant player, it remains to be seen if anything will be done at all to stop this new form of colonization, because China's investment in Africa is a complex and multifaceted issue with potential benefits and big drawbacks. So, as China's presence in Africa continues to expand, it is important to carefully consider the long-term implications and to ensure that the interests of the African people are protected. Sure, on the surface, China's investment in Africa might look like a win-win. Africa gets much-needed infrastructure and economic development, and China gets access to market and sources for raw materials. But scratch a little bit the surface and you'll find out much more sinister story. Now, as the Chinese flag is raised over African ports and African people and resources, we must ask ourselves one thing: is this the future we want for Africa? A future of debt and servitude? Hello my friend, Hidlson here. You can't imagine how happy I am to see you here in the end of the video. Well, this video took me hardly 6 months to get done, and that's because it's a subject that is kind of scary to deal with, at least for me. So I had to refine the script for like 6 to 7 times, otherwise I was afraid to receive a mail from the Chinese government asking me to leave Earth. Now, if you think this video is helpful in any way, make sure to click the like button, grab the link, and share the video with your friends and family. I know you're already tired of this gospel in every YouTube video, but fact is, this really helps a lot in making the video more reachable to other people. Also, do turn on the bell for this channel so you don't miss important videos like this one.
Trojan. Then Hidlson.
Building the tallest in Addis Ababa cost around 200 million.
Over the crucial and critical port to China on lease.
We've already seen that Chinese investment in infrastructure has linked to increasing Chinese that may end up becoming somewhat of a leverage point to try to push some of these countries to engage side with China on critical issues that are important to the U.S. or to its allies.
But while the US has focused its Africa strategy on aid and social services, China has been building.